There it is. It worked. Yay.
I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm guessing I should put this here. And is it recording? It is. Okay.
Okay. Hopefully that'll pick me up. I don't want to lay on the floor and do this.
No, it should be all right. Okay. So
Okay. Okay, cool.
All right, and is that okay?
Works
Yeah.
for me.
All right. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming down and talking to us, ladies and gentlemen. Kate Edwards, thank you very much.
So when I was here, when was I here? February? Jan, it seemed like 5 years ago. Who was here when I spoke? Okay, so hopefully there's going to be redundancy in here, but since it's been so long, maybe you and I don't remember what I said. So I'm happy at some point if you're just like, you know what, we heard all this crap, just cut it, you know. But I'm also here to be a resource. If you have any questions too about anything related to the game industry, I'm more than happy to talk about that too. But since, you know, there's a lot of statistics and stuff in here that talk about crunch time and diversity and all these issues facing the industry right now, which are just as much an issue today as they were back in January. So I just thought I would talk about this stuff again. It's changed a little bit, but anyway, I run the International Game Developers Association, and if you don't know what the IGDA is, basically we are the global professional association for anyone who makes video games. And it's been around since 1994. And if you know what the Association for Computing Machinery is, the ACM, they're the ones responsible for the SIGGRAPH events, for example. So ACM was basically that. If you're a computer, like hardcore computer science programmer type, and you're not in the game industry, you're probably a member of ACM. And so the IGA was actually created to basically be an ACM for game developers. That was the whole point of it. So our mission is really simple. We want to advance the careers and enhance the lives of game developers. However much we do that, whether it's through, I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, who are we? Well, there's a lot of professionals of any kind you can imagine, whether it's indie or studio or people in emerging markets all around the world. We have a lot of unemployed people as well who are looking for work. You know, obviously a lot of students, both academic, students and faculty, because we do have a lot of faculty who are involved in research and whatnot, and of course people who are just starting out, and also probably another category I'd put on here are what I call hobbyist developers. So especially because of the rise of independent development, we're seeing a lot of people who, you know, by day they're an accountant and by night they go home and make games and they publish them on the iOS store. And you ask them, shh, back there. They're my parents, so they were my right up here. But anyway, there's the hobbyist developer. So basically, they have no aspiration to be a professional game developer, but they are game developers. That's what they do in their spare time. You know, and of course, we also have studio affiliates, so companies who want to support our mission and partners, which are basically non-game producing companies. Our top priorities that we focus on are these big four, so advocating on key issues that affect game developers. So this year we've been very vocal about the crunch issue. At GDC back in March, we announced a big crunch initiative in which our goal is basically to out the companies that are doing a good job on managing crunch time and managing how employees work and deal with their work-life balance. It's really tempting to hang the ones publicly if they're doing a really crappy job, but you know that negative reinforcement really doesn't go as far as positive reinforcement. And we also work for professional development and mentorship. We're actually trying to roll out a mentorship program in the near future. We are doing this year at various events around the world. We've done mentor cafes where basically it's like speed dating for mentors and mentees. So you just like walk in there, you find someone who's in a field that's related to what you want to do or what you are doing, and just say, hey, can I talk to you about something? And just sit down and talk to them. Of course, networking community, we have over 130 chapters around the world, and a lot in the US and Canada. We also have ones in places like Tehran and Bangladesh and Tunisia and elsewhere. And then that kind of ties into international awareness, because that's a big thing that we try and reinforce, is that we are all in this together. And one of the worst problems I see when I travel a lot is a lot of the emerging markets feel that they are completely cut off and isolated, that they have no one to talk to. And it's true, a lot of these emerging markets, like I was just in Morocco 2 weeks ago, and yeah, they don't have the education resources, they don't have the professional expertise because their industry is still growing. So they're really hungry for knowledge, and yet they've got a huge community of developers who are developing games as best as they can with what they know and with the tools they have. So yeah, we have communities, again, we have chapters all over the place. We also have academic chapters based at specific schools. And a lot of our academic chapters are basically pretty much exactly what you guys are doing. We have special interest groups in a lot of different topics. A lot of them are vocational based, like production, writing, things like that. And we also have special interest groups for affinity groups, like women in games, blacks in gaming, Jewish game developers, and a lot of other groups like that. And then we have different committees that are focused on specific issues. So the communities that we deal with, basically this is kind of what sums up who they are. And I see, you know, having gotten to know your group a bit better this year, I mean, I see a lot of this here as well. I mean, the passion part, as you'll see later when I talk to some of the developer statistics that we gather, I mean, the passion part's a given. That's really kind of comes with the art form. The other parts kind of come in different quantities depending on who you are, the desire to learn and improve, and the willingness to share and teach what you know. And one of the things I love about working in the game industry is that this tends to be pretty true no matter where I go. There seems to be a very outgoing spirit among game developers to help each other out, for the most part. And also thinking both locally and globally, being willing to connect globally if you need to get the knowledge you need. Just some of the stuff that came out of the IGDA. The Game Developers Conference, GDC, started as an IGDA thing way back when, and then it spun off, and then the Global Game Jam, which is in January, that was started in the IGDA and also was spun off. We have game design curriculum standards that our game education SIG created that is used in a lot of game design schools. We have developer credit standards to help companies understand when they're supposed to credit developers, which is always. And our developer satisfaction survey, which I'm actually going to be talking about. Now, in my role as executive director, basically in a nonprofit, the executive director is the CEO. And so I run this global circus. And in my job, I go around talking and making weird hand gestures and going to events and visiting studios and visiting game jams. I've been to a lot of game jams. I've done a lot of judging at game jams. Talking to government officials, I do a lot of that as well. That's the Minister of Telecommunications for Tunisia, who actually used to own a game company in the UK. So this guy totally loves games, and he's totally on board with the game industry. And yeah, this was just about a year ago in Norway. And that's because I am an avid cosplayer. So my point in saying this is I'm painting a picture of what an absolute geek/dork that I am. The middle one was a newer Thor picture that I took at San Diego Comic-Con this year. And a lot of this is because of my daughter on the right. She's a costume designer who lives down here. She actually works in Glendale. And yeah, so we have a ton of fun together. And I'm also such a geek that when I was in Norway last year, this was actually Halloween last year, October 31st. I was going from Bergen to Oslo, got off the train just so I could see where they filmed The Empire Strikes Back. Obviously, there's not as much snow as when they were filming. It was a really crappy day. And then earlier this year, I was in Tunisia. So, of course, you're in Tunisia. What do? You visit the Lars homestead, right? So I'm a total geek in many ways, and I have been a gamer all of my life, pretty much. I mean, this was my first video game. That's how old I am. And, for those of us in that generation, I mean, really this event was pretty much like this event, if you've seen 2001. I mean, the monolith shows up and what happens? Humanity was changed completely. And so for us, having this machine show up that we can interact with and play with was just phenomenal. And every few months we'd go back to that same spot. This was actually, the first place I saw that was in the Sears store in Laguna Hills Mall, which is no longer there anymore. But yeah, then they would replace it with like Space Wars, and then there would be other games that they'd keep replacing it. It's like these magical boxes kept changing. So that was, so I've always been a gamer. I've been a huge geek. My career path in the industry looks something like this. So when I was younger, I really wanted to be an astronaut. because I'm old enough to remember watching the moon landing in '69 on my grandmother's TV. And, or I wanted to be a writer, so I didn't know, so astronaut/writer. But then I said, no, what I really want to do is be a conceptual artist on Star Wars. I got to work on Star Wars. I was 12 years old when the first movie came out, so I was obsessed. And that's actually what brought me here to Cal State Long Beach. I was going to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo for aerospace engineering for 1 year, got killed by calculus, and so I came here to do industrial design. Because I found out that all of the storyboard artists at Lucasfilm at the time, like Joe Johnston and some of the other well-known people there, they all had industrial design as their background. And at the time in the Cal State system, it was either Cal State San Jose or Cal State Long Beach had ID programs. So I went ahead and did that, and did that for a couple years here. It really improved my artistic skills, but then I'm just like, the program really frustrated me because you had to do a portfolio review, and if you got in, then you had a 2-year program after that. And they said every person who tries for the first time doesn't get through the portfolio review. So you're looking at least at 3 years to finish the program after starting 2 years. I knew some people who had tried 3 or 4 times to get through the portfolio review and failed. So they working for like 6 or 7 years on their undergraduate degree, which is just BS. So I, just on a total whim, switched my major to cartography and geography. Because I love maps and I love culture, I love travel, and as a cartographer I could still use my artistic skills. And so that's what I did. I became a cartographer and geographer, and graduated here with a BA in geography and a certificate in cartography. Worked for a year at Thomas Brothers Maps down in Irvine before they were bought out. And then I decided I wanted to do more than that, and that's what brought me to grad school in Seattle, where I'm still based, the University of Washington. So I did my master's degree 25 years ago on using virtual worlds for cartography. And back then, of course, VR was like 200 times more expensive and 200 times slower than it is now. So for a lot of us old folks who dealt with VR in the first round, I'm really excited about what's happening now. I think it's really cool. I've used all of the technologies, and it's just really cool for me to see 25 years later, it actually works. It works the way we intended 25 years ago. So I did that, but as I was starting my PhD program, I got pulled into Microsoft to be a cartographer on Encarta Encyclopedia, because they said, hey, we need a cartographer. So I'm like, sure, I can do that. I went over to Microsoft and became a perma-temp for like 3.5 years, because it was good pay, and I was a grad student, so I needed money. And so they kept renewing my contract, and I kept doing it, and eventually got a full-time position. And when I got the full-time position, they basically said, what do you want to do? What we really need is this. We need someone to focus on the geopolitical stuff in the maps. So disputed boundaries, place names that countries don't agree on, all of those issues that get cartographers into a lot of trouble. And I said, oh, I would love to do that. I've already had a huge interest in that and had some foundation in that with my geography background. So that's what I did. So I worked on Encarta for a few years, but then I saw an opening. We had this major issue happen in 1997 where Encarta was released, and the Korean government was really pissed off about it because there was a certain border issue that I'm not going to go into details about. And so we fixed it. We fixed that issue, and there was another issue with the name Sea of Japan. Now, in Korea, they call it the EC. They don't say Sea of Japan. And so they got really upset seeing only Sea of Japan. So in Encarta, we decided to double label it Sea of Japan and then parentheses EC. And there's a point in me telling you this. So we fixed it, Korean government, fine, great, okay, whatever. 3 months later, the first version of Age of Empires comes out, and it only says Sea of Japan on it. And the Korean government loses it. They're like, okay, we just told you guys 3 months ago to fix it, and you didn't fix it. Now, of course, at a company like Microsoft, Encarta's being worked on way over there on that side of the company, and Age of Empires way over there. They never talk to each other. They have no reason to talk to each other. So that's where my light bulb came on, and I said, that's what this company needs, is they need some group that coordinates this kind of knowledge across the company, because this is a huge risk issue. Because at the time, because of that one problem between Encarta and Age of Empires, the Korean government was actually talking about banning Windows in Office, which that's when Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer actually listened, when the bread and butter of the company is going to be banned. So I created a internal team called Geopolitical Strategy. It took me about 7 months to get approval for it, but I created the team. And so my job at Microsoft was to protect the entire company against political and cultural risks in all of their products. So Word, Office, Windows, everything. But then the Microsoft Game Studio got started. And so me being the gamer geek that I am, all of their games fell under my responsibility. So in that capacity as this geopolitical strategist for Microsoft, I actually ended up working on pretty much every first-party game Microsoft made between 1995 and when I left in 2005. So all the Halos, Fables, Age of Empires, Forza, all of that stuff. I worked on all of it. And what I mean working on it, what I would do is often I would basically read the scripts, I'd see all the character artwork, I'd see the symbols that are going to use in the game. I'd basically examine everything, that's all of the content, to get a sense of what could they be missing, something that's going to be a problem, like a historical issue in Age of Empires. There were issues in Age of Empires that we had to deal with, and I'm getting sidetracked because I love talking about this, but that's like a whole nother talk about what I call culturalization work. So that's what I did though for Microsoft. And then I left Microsoft because I got tired of working at Microsoft and just became a consultant and did it on my own. And that's when I started with the intent of working primarily on games. And so this is when I really got involved in the IGDA 2004, 2005. Because I knew that IGA was a great way to get involved in the industry and to get to know other people in the industry. And so, so I started the localization special interest group in the IGDA, and then I helped revive the Seattle chapter. And then by late 2012, they approached me and asked me if I would like to be the executive director. And by that time, I had been a consultant for 7 years, and I still do it on the side. I'm still a consultant. I just finished my work on Dead Rising 4. I worked on Rise of the Tomb Raider for 2 years. I've worked on Gigantic. I'm working on Mass Effect Andromeda right now. And what else am I working on? I don't know, a few other things. But so I do that on the side. So that's my hobby. Being the executive director is my day job. So anyway, so that was my weird path. And the cool thing though is because BioWare has been a client of mine for 11 years now. I got to work on Star Wars: The Old Republic for 4 years. So I worked on Star Wars. It was awesome. So not necessarily a movie, but still it was Star Wars. So kind of my circle was complete. But anyway, so when we're talking about industry, we often hear this term all the time. Everyone talks about the game industry, and I'm going to use that term a lot when I talk today. But just to kind of step back a minute from this, the good old Latin term for it, meaning diligence and active, we kind of get the idea of what industry is supposed to be. And we often have this kind of image of industry. It's a machine. It's with cogs, and it's supposed to work with precision. But this is not what we are. This is not what the industry is. The game industry is not this, and no, that's not Long Beach, but this is the game industry. The game industry is us. It's people, because we are a creative industry. And so we are what comprise the industry. So when I hear developers talk about, well, the industry screwed me over, it's like, well, who though? The industry didn't. Maybe a specific manager did, or a specific company, or someone acting on behalf of that company, but the industry is that's just us being us. This is a company in Europe that has this on the back of their company t-shirts, and I love this. Our #1 game is our people, and they have their emphasis in the right place. One of the things we struggle with as a, quote, industry, which is really more of an individual struggle, is this balance. We, as creative people working in a technology industry, we are constantly dealing with this balance of what is more important to me personally as well as to the company in which I work. So, dealing with artistic freedom, that's one of the things I hear all the time from developers, and even in my culturalization work, I dealt all the time with artists and writers and so on who, if I tell them, well, I don't think we should do it that way because it's going to offend someone, they're like, who are you to tell me that? This is my creative vision. I want to do what I want to do. I'm like, okay, I get it, but you know what? If we do it the way you want to do it, then we're not going to make money in that market. So you're basically, like an example like Korea, we can do what you want to do, but then Korea's not going to buy it and they're going to ban the game. And that creates a really negative vibe, not only for your product, but it kind of creates waves within that region because people know that, oh, Korea banned that game for a reason. Maybe we should look twice at this before we allow people to buy it. And so it's constantly what I call, in this diagram, the fulcrum of compromise. We are constantly weighing this issue. You know, how artistically free will we be compared to maximizing revenue? And this is really one of those core dynamics that defines the difference between AAA and indie games. Because indie games, one of the reasons I think they've been so refreshing in this industry is that it tends to lean more on this side because they have the freedom to do what they want to do. They still want to make money off it, of course, but the indie games, most of the time, they're in a position where they're able to take more risks, take more creative risks, where in the AAA side, it's all about the other side. That's why you see Call of Duty 14 and Halo 25 and whatever else, because they're safe. They're safe bets. They know there's an audience out there, so their job is to maximize revenue. And they maximize revenue, of course, doesn't even stop with the game. You look at something like Rovio with Angry Birds. It's merchandising. 45% of their revenue comes from merchandise. Doesn't even come from the game itself anymore. You know, which is obviously something that Disney has perfected very, very well. So this is something that kind of is in the background of this whole discussion about the industry. Now this developer survey that we do in the IGDA, we do it every year. We always launch it at the beginning of GDC week, and we run it for about 6 weeks, and then we release the data later in the year. So like the 2016 survey report is going to be out. I've actually got it sitting in my inbox. It's going to be out in a couple weeks or so. But basically, we relaunched it. We used to do something called the Quality of Life Survey, but then we reconfigured it. And now we do this every year. We collect a lot of demographic information, as you'll see, but we really want to understand two things from developers. How do they feel about their jobs, their individual job functions, and their place within it? And then how do they feel about the industry as a whole? So what are the kind of perceptions are they getting? So here's just a glimpse at some of the demographics. I'm not going to read all this, but you just get a quick sense of who was responding, the age group. You know, the location to me is a very important thing. So you can see that North America makes about 60% of the survey. And we do localize the survey into 7 languages, so we're trying to keep expanding that as well to maximize the reach of it. Now we ask questions like this, like why do you want to join the game industry? And this is where we kind of get into the no-brainer stuff with these big bars: earn a living, do what I enjoy, or share my passion for games by working in the industry. It's like, yep, that's, you know, that's not a secret. And we ask, how long do you want to work in the game industry? Indefinitely. So, and when you look at some of the qualitative written answers that came from the survey, some people said, until I drop dead. You know, so it's, I mean, in a way that's kind of great. In another way, it's a little scary. But, you know, which statement best describes your relationship with your employment? You know, largest answer, this is my career and a large part of my life, which I'm glad that's the answer. The top answer, this is my career and my life. So this kind of reflects a little bit better work-life balance, in my view. So I'm kind of glad to see that. So what's cool about this, though, I mean, so this basically underscores the fact that game development, it's an art form. You see these kind of responses are no different from writers, filmmakers, artists. I mean, it's just they reflect this, that it's a passion, it's just what we do. It's not something that we necessarily choose to do. We may kind of walk backwards into it through other career paths, but it's still something that we really want to do. Now, when we ask this question, what factors do you think make a negative perception of the industry in the eye of the public? What's really interesting to me is that working conditions is the #1 answer. Now, I don't know about you, but when I talk to people about the industry, like people who are not in the industry, they don't know anything about the working conditions. They might know a little bit, like, yeah, I hear you guys work really hard, but they don't really know anything other than that. So it's interesting that that would be the perception from game developers. When we ask people, why would you want to leave the game industry? I want a better quality of life, burned out, found a job with better paying hours. So we're kind of hearing a theme here. You know, we ask also, so in terms of employment status for the people who answered the survey, you can see there about 70% of the respondents have full-time permanent jobs. And when we asked them, how many employers have you had in the last 5 years, the average was 4. I don't know why those got off a little bit, but anyway, the average number of jobs is 4. That's pretty disruptive, because us in the industry, we hear about like a lot of studio closures and people shifting around within the industry, and that's not completely unusual for creative industries like film. People finish a film project and they move to another company or they move to another project, but still 4 jobs, especially full-time permanent jobs in 5 years, is pretty disruptive, and that's a lot. some of the other realities that came out of this that we saw in the data. Now the top number basically reflects a lot of indie developers. So they're not making a lot of money at this point. And I didn't put up the correlation between people making that level and whether or not they actually have another job or that they're actually trying to subsist on that amount of money. To me, this is one of the most alarming things, though, is 38% say they receive no compensation whatsoever for working crunch time. Now, crunch time, I'm sure we've all heard of it, right? I mean, we all experience it. I mean, you're in school. Of course you experience crunch time. What's interesting is, now, do you know what this movie is?
Something Bridge over the River Kwai.
Yes, thank you. Because, and if you don't know what it is, then maybe I'll just show this instead. So, from Game Dev Story. Either way, the point about showing the Bridge over the River Kwai picture, this is, if you don't know the movie, it's basically British prisoners of war at a Japanese prison camp in World War II. And the Japanese general basically kept telling the prisoners, just be happy in your work. You know, you're prisoners of war in the middle of a jungle, just be happy in your work. And I find some correlation with the game industry because oftentimes I hear when people complain that, hey, I don't want to work 16 hours a day for 3 months at a time, you know, the management will often say something like, you know, you're lucky to work here. I can go find 20 people today who will take your spot like that. So just basically shut up and be happy in your work. And obviously that's the wrong response because that's basically treating the person like they're the cog in the machine, which we know they're not. Now, what's interesting to me is that crunch mode in every other industry is pretty much called poor project management. But in the game industry, it's taken on its own luster and sort of this, you know, interesting, almost like a rite of passage kind of thing. Like, I'll often hear developers say stuff like, don't you remember the crunch of 2008 when we slept under our desks during Christmas and New Year's? Wasn't that awesome? You know, we didn't see our families, we didn't see anyone. We just kind of smelled each other and it was gross. And, it's like, no, it's not cool. It's not great at all. I mean, even earlier this year at the DICE Awards in Vegas, one of the winners for Fallout 4 got up there and said, oh, I think it's going to be great to see my kids again. And you think about that, that's not a cool statement. You know, as a parent myself, I mean, one of the things I would like to do is find him 10 years from now and ask him, what would you rather have, that award on the shelf or a year with your kids back? And, you know, it's a no-brainer. There is no decision there other than the right one. But one of the things I want to make a distinction about, though, is that when I'm talking about crunch, I'm mainly talking about, like, company-imposed, top-down, you will work X amount of hours for X amount of time. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to get rid of in this industry. Because crunch, in my view, should always be voluntary. It should always be compensated. But the difference, though, is with what we're calling creative groove. Because I think a lot of us experience this, where we're just working on something and we're just like, oh, you're in that creative mode where you just want to go on a tear and like maybe even work all night long. And then you might do that every once in a while. You don't do it for like 6 months, you know, until you're like ready to just, you know, go crazy. So that kind of groove is totally fine, I think, and that comes naturally with the creative process because it's like I know tons of writers and painters, people like that, they'll just like, you know, get in that mode where they're not going to stop, and so, you know, they'll just do it until they reach a point where like, okay, I got that out of my system. And I think that's okay, but that tends to be really short and punctuated. Now, developers tend to disagree with the statement that crunch is a necessary part of game development. And some of the reasons they give, I mean, not a secret, is that they cite poor, unrealistic scheduling. One of the biggest problems that we see, and it's kind of related to feature creep as well, and in my experience of working in all these games over the years, is the biggest problem I've seen is like right before the final gold master is supposed to be pressed, let's say it's going to be pressed on Monday, and it's maybe the Tuesday or Wednesday before, you'll get someone like a writer or an artist or someone who will say, oh my God, I've got the best idea for this character. If we just add this one thing, or if we just write this one chunk of dialogue that we didn't do, or something like that, then it's going to be way better. It's like there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that that last-minute crunch thing is going to make any difference to the outcome of the game in terms of the business side, in terms of that maximizing revenue part. I totally understand the desire to be creatively complete, but as a creative work, games are never done. Just like films are never done. If they were, then we'd never see director's cuts, or even 5 different director's cuts of a film like Blade Runner. But you know, it's just the nature of creative work. You know, every writer will tell you, well, yeah, I got it to where I basically got it good enough, and you know, but I was up against a publishing deadline. That's what stopped me. Just like a film, they're basically filming to a release date because they need to get the theaters set up. And so games are the same way. We have release dates for games, and we have to reach a certain point. The problem I see, though, a lot of managers are not willing to say no. They're saying, no, you know what, that's a great idea. Let's table that. Let's save it for the DLC, or let's save it for version 2. But we're not going to do that. We're not going to, you know, kill ourselves to put that in there. But a lot of times they don't do that. Now, the good news is that crunch is getting a little better. Over the last 12 years, what we're actually been seeing is that a decrease in the time of crunch, like the amount of weeks that is crunched, and then in those weeks, the amount of time actually crunching is decreasing. But it's still very prevalent, but it's getting slightly better. Now, the interesting part, though, is what does this lead to? This kind of constant death march kind of approach to development. Well, what's interesting is that, you know, when we ask developers, what do you think about unionizing? And 56% said they would vote for the union today if a vote was held to create a union in the industry. Now, there's a lot of issues around unionization that are very complicated, but what's interesting to me is that when we asked this question in 2009, only 33% said yes. And so now we've got 56%. And, you know, if you've been following the whole SAG-AFTRA strike with the voice actors in the game industry, that's raised the issue of unionization across the industry again. And so it's a complex issue. It's really, and we could talk about that forever. I don't want to dwell on it right now, but it is something that we're definitely looking at. Now, in terms of the crunch, one of the things I'll point out, we released this back in September. It's a white paper called Crunch Hurts. And so I don't know if you know what TakeThis.org is. It's an organization that focuses on mental health issues in the game industry, not just on the developer side, but also on the gamer side. And so it's a really great organization, and they've got clinical psychologists that are involved in this effort. Raphael, I just did a presentation with him in Seattle at the Mobile Game Forum a couple weeks ago. But it's basically a 14-page or so white paper. It's really good. I really encourage you to take a look at it. Some of the highlights that came from it, for example, like they quantified that essentially in the US that productivity because of fatigue amounts to almost $2,000 per employee per year, and that working over 11-hour days yields almost 2.5 times higher risk of depression. We've basically, through different studies that they've done, they've shown that about 2 weeks is about the maximum time that people can crunch before the return on the time investment just completely plummets. It's just their ability to hang with it just doesn't exist. What's really interesting, though, is that affecting game quality, because one of the things that they were able to correlate is that the greater the crunch, the more bugs showed up in the game, and the lower the Metacritic scores in the final product of the game, which is exactly the opposite of what management and a lot of companies would tell you. The reason they're crunching is to up the quality, but what they're finding is that it does exactly the opposite because, frankly, people just can't keep up with it. So when we ask then, why would you want to be self-employed or freelance? Well, gee, it's not a surprise. More control over working conditions. It's not a shock. And when we ask what kind of companies you want to work for, they want to work as an indie company more than AAA. That's also not a shock. We also ask about which specific company by name would you want to work for. Now, Valve, I'll have to say, is always number one. And I think part of that is because when they released their employee handbook a couple years ago, it's like most people in the industry were just like, this is nirvana. This is where I want to go to die. And, you know, even though you talk to Valve employees, they're like, it's not all true. It's just, you know. But, you know, these, BioWare, Blizzard, Valve are always in the top 5. My own company is also always in the top 5, which again kind of, I think, underscores the creative spirit of game developers, that ultimately what they want to have is control of their own creative content. It's great to work on other franchises and get experience that way, but ultimately a lot of people want to just do their own thing. And that's also evidence when we ask which platforms that they think they're going to focus on in the next 5 years. Those are the top 3 indie platforms: Steam, PC Online, Android. So that's also not a big shock to see that. So we know that, you know, independent game development, it is becoming a default method for game creation. It's not a surprise to me that when the PS4 and the Xbox One launched, they launched with all this fanfare about indie game support. Well, do you know what that is? That was basically Microsoft and Sony saying, we can't make original games anymore. We don't know how to do it because we're focused on the maximizing revenue part, because the maximizing revenue part is what funds our ability to make consoles. And so that's why they turned to the indie community, because they realize that that's where a lot of the creative innovation is coming from. It's also far more widespread. I mean, like I said, I travel all over the place, and I go to a lot of emerging markets, and there's just this phenomenal amount of work being done in all these different places, and it's really exciting to see. And I also think this is where a lot more of the public are seeing indie games, and they're finding more connection with the indie games because they are more creative. They have the ability to create emotional responses that you typically don't see from like big franchise games, you know. So you know, stuff like The Last of Us and the Stanley Parable and things like that. Really thought-provoking, really interesting games, and those are the kinds of things that are getting attention. And I also think it's, you know, as we know with being an indie developer, you have a much closer connection to your players. And that's for better or worse. There's downsides to that too, as anyone who's done a Kickstarter knows. But, you know, but that's also part of getting people who are players in the player community to understand better about how we create games. So, so we have a strong passion, we know that. No plans for stop making games, that's great. We work way too much, often without pay, that sucks. We want creative independence, and that's cool. But we're also mostly male and mostly white in this industry. And so when we look at the gender diversity stats that came from the developer survey, this is how it broke down. And so 20% female in the game industry in our survey. Some more specific surveys that I cited, like in the UK, they did a survey where it was 15%, in Finland it was 20%, and that's generally consistent with what we've been seeing, is about 15 to 20%. You know, the general technology sector tends to be more like 10 to 15%. So people will say, yeah, we're doing way better. It's like, no, we're not doing that much better, honestly. In fact, it really pissed me off because a couple times this year, if you know who Mike Gallagher is, he runs the Entertainment Software Association, the ESA. And so I know them very well. And so Mike got on stage at a conference, and a reporter asked him, what do you think about diversity? And he said, well, you know, according to the VGDA, we're 20%, and in the general tech sector, it's like 15%. So we're doing great. I'm just like, it's only 20%. No, it's not great. You know, ethnically, it's even worse in terms of the balance that we're seeing. So, and there's a lot of efforts underway that I'm a part of. I'm part of a group called Operation Diversity in Gaming, which involves representatives from Microsoft, Sony, Oculus, Google, and we're all trying to make this huge industry-wide concerted effort to actually change the diversity and inclusion aspect. Going back to the slide I showed earlier, where working editions was the #1 response for negative perception, what's really interesting to me, sexism in the games was #2. And then sexism in the workforce was #4. Keep in mind, 80% of the respondents are male. So this is not just women saying this. This is across the board developers citing this as an issue. So I think this is really interesting. We asked, do you think there's equal treatment and opportunity for everyone in the industry? Most people said no. In the US, what's interesting is you take the ESA's data, about 44% of players are women, and yet only 20% of developers are women. So we have this disparity here that's really interesting. So basically we know that not just in gender, but also ethnically and other, however else you want to slice it, games have basically become a ubiquitous form of entertainment. It's just another thing that humans do, along with television and film and radio and books and everything else. It's just one of the things that we do, and yet we still have this kind of disparity on the industry side. We also have this problem with the wage gap. Now granted, this is not strictly a game industry problem. This is a problem across many different industries. But in the game industry, this is how it breaks down according to a couple of years ago. So that's what the average salary gap it looks like. The smallest being in the game design profession, the largest being in audio. And there was actually an audio salary survey that was released a few months ago that's much more recent, and it basically shows the same thing. But then when we ask, developers, but is this important? Is diversity important? And yes, 75%, 79%, they answered very important or somewhat important. So they believe it's something that we should have. It's a value, and they even believe that having localized versions of games, like appealing to other cultures, is really important. Now, just to kind of set the definition here, now diversity and inclusion, I think most of us know what diversity is, because we've been hearing that for a long time now, but it's basically just the ways that we differ. But what we're trying to focus on in the industry is more about this, about inclusion. What does inclusion mean? What does it look like? And it's really taking the notion of diversity, but how does that actually work in the game development process? And what is that supposed to, how is that supposed to be integrated? So here's an example that you may have heard about. Now this is from the television side, but FX Network. So in just a couple years ago, they said 12% of their directors for their programs were women or people of color. And so the CEO basically made a decision, a conscious decision, and said, basically, we're just going to do this. We're going to change this problem. And so he made a concerted effort. He basically put out the call to all of his producers, says, you will hire directors who are more diverse. So here we are, 2016-2017 season, 51%. So in that very short amount of time, they were able to make that level of change. In another part of an interview, he basically just said, it's just a matter of will. It's not a secret. It's not something you have to work out. He says, you just do it. You just say, we're going to do it. Intel did the same thing. Early last year at the Consumer Electronics Show, they announced their big diversity and technology initiative. And they said, we're going to make changes in Intel. A year later, so earlier this year, they released their annual report. They made some very significant changes in the picture of the diversity makeup in their company in just 1 year. And that's because Brian Krzanich, the CEO, basically said, we're just going to do this. We're going to invest in it, and we're going to make it happen. And what's interesting, too, now you can make the correlation or not. I just find this interesting that maybe there is a correlation here. Someone would have to study this more closely. But the Emmy nominations for FX Networks in 2015, here they were, 38 nominations, and then for this year was 56. Is there a correlation with the diversity of the people involved in the creative process? Maybe there is. I'll give you another example. So, yeah, that's me. You may recognize Rami there, Ismail, and then that's Christina Reed. So this was at the Leadership Summit in Seattle that the IGDA did last year. And so Christina Reed, if you don't know who she is, she was the producer on Big Hero 6. And she was also producer of the shorts Paperman and Feast. So in her 3 projects at Disney, she's won 3 Oscars. Not bad. So she left Disney, but now she's back at Disney as of a couple months ago because they gave her an offer she couldn't refuse. But she gave a fantastic talk, a keynote talk at our leadership summit about what inclusion means. And this is the kind of the core of what she said. Inclusion is the act of making everyone welcome along with their uncomfortable ideas, unorthodox strategies, and unruly manners. When you make people feel welcome and valued, they engage and give you their biggest and best, boldest ideas. And what she described in this scenario, she completely made a one-to-one connection with their success, getting the highest possible honor in their field with this inclusive process they did. And she didn't even talk about diversity. She wasn't talking about gender and ethnicity and all that. What she was talking about is like when they would have their dailies or when they would do reviews of different like character design or something, they always invited every single person in the building to show up. The kitchen staff, the cleaning staff, the reception staff, whoever it was, everyone was invited into the room to review and give feedback, and they made it very clear, this is a level playing field. Nobody has seniority in this room during this. So just say what you want to say. And so they were able to get amazing ideas and get reflections from people working associated with the project. And then, of course, it was up to the core creative team to decide what of all of those ideas are actually going to work. But the fact that they cast such a wide net and we're able to bring in all these ideas that some of the core creative people, because we know this in even the game industry, is that oftentimes you lose the forest through the trees when you're so focused on something you're working on, and all it takes is just one person to wander up and say, what the hell is that? I don't understand what that's supposed to be. And of course, the developer is like, well, it's supposed to be blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, I don't get it. So anyway, so the industry we deserve, in my view, is when we have working conditions and demographics that aren't a deterrent, because I still hear that from some people who say, I would love to work in games, I love games, but I hear you guys work a lot, or you work too much. So I can go get a job like at Google or Facebook where I'm gonna work hard, but I'm not gonna be crunching like 16-hour days. Crunch is going to be rare. It'll be a choice, and it'll always be compensated. And I think we're moving in that direction, not as fast as I would like, but we're getting there. I also think that those who make games will better reflect those who play them, and that is happening. And a lot of that's happening because of indie development. And it's basically, what's great about independent development is the democratization of the game tools. So now that Unity is free, Unreal is free, a lot of the education out there is readily available. If someone doesn't go to like a school, they can still find tutorials on YouTube or find other people in a community. So I'm starting to meet people who are making amazing games, and these people are self-taught. Like I may have given this example before, but last year I met a young woman, she was a senior in high school at the time, who had already made 40 games. She was self-taught on Unity, and now she's got 5 games on the iOS store, and she's got like 2 million players on her games. And now she applied to MIT and Caltech and got into MIT. And she just, when I met her, she's like, I just want to be a game designer someday. It's like, you already are. You just want to get better at it. That's all. Just like all of us, you just want to improve. And then finally, the games that people play are going to be far more varied and diverse. And again, we're already seeing that too. Again, thanks to mainly indie development. And I also think the artistic value of games is not going to be an issue anymore. That is something that we as an organization still fight against. A lot of political ideas that games are still not healthy. That is changing. The main thing that we have to kind of take heart is that if we can't change their minds now, the good news is that in 10 to 15 years, every single politician on earth will have grown up with video games. And that's going to change the landscape of political opinion of games. So I know that's going to happen. It's happened to every other media form that's ever been released. Whether, rock and roll, the waltz, the printed book, they all were pushed back by society. And games I think we're going to see the tail end of that for games. So that's it. That was the main stuff I wanted to convey. But I'm happy to answer any questions, if you have any questions at all about anything. Yes?
So there's a lot of good stuff in there about like gender diversity and ethnic diversity. Do you guys survey about like LGBT diversity and stuff? And what's like the output of that?
We do. So that is part of our data, and that is another area where it's getting better very slowly. I mean, obviously, it's a very underrepresented group in the industry. Like we have an LGBTQ SIG in the IGA. It's a great community. We did a mentor cafe at GamerX. When was that? A couple months ago, I guess, and or a month ago, whenever it was. And so I see a lot of enthusiasm in the community and about a willingness to be more open about who they are in the industry. They're still getting pushed back, no different from women and other people though, in some corners where there's a little bit of resistance, but that's dying out. You'll never get that from the official level because every company's like, well, no, we're diverse, we welcome everyone. But there are some company cultures that are not necessarily conducive, to diversity, but that's changing.
So kind of feeding off the whole you're lucky to have this job syndrome. One thing that I've heard is that there's this kind of addendum that's sometimes stated, sometimes implied, where it's like, you're lucky to have this job, and if you quit in the middle of crunch time, you're not going to be able to get another job, or something like that. And like, is that how that works?
No.
Okay.
Maybe not at that company, because that means basically the douchebags running the company are going to put you on a blacklist or something, say we don't want to hire this person because they bailed on us when we were forcing them to work ridiculous hours. So shame on them. It depends on the circle. I mean, sometimes you will get people. Word spreads. We are a growing industry, but we're still somewhat small. I mean, you go to GDC and it's like everyone's there. It's like it's a big family reunion, or you go to Gamescom in Germany in August, and you see a lot of people that you know. But that is changing very quickly because of the democratization of development and indie development. It's just spreading like so quickly. So I think in some circles that would happen, but for the most part, I don't think that's realistic. I mean, it's probably, there are some specific companies, I think, where that would happen. But I think especially today, one of the reasons why we did the Crunch Initiative this year at GDC, it's been 10 years since the EA spouse issue. So I don't know if you've heard about EA spouse, but basically where, and I know who EA spouse is, Erin Hoffman-John, who lives in the Bay Area. So she was married to someone who worked at EA, ridiculous crunch hours, and she wrote this anonymous blog post at the time, and basically was complaining about this issue. And it was one of the first times where the crunch issue was really exposed for what it is in the industry. And it created huge ripples, I mean, huge uproar. And so here we are 10 years later, and while we've been following the crunch issue for all of that time, I wanted to kind of refloat the balloon and see how people reacted. And I was really encouraged to see that the great majority of people responded like, yeah, crunch is BS. We should not be doing this anymore. This is ridiculous. I mean, yeah, for short periods of time, like I said, like the 2-week thing, that's fine, but there's still companies that basically go to get hired by the company, and if you ask them, well, how much do you crunch? And if they say, well, yeah, we're like in crunch maybe like 4 to 6 months a year. It's like, that's the wrong answer. I mean, if you're crunching 4 to 6 months a year, your project management skills are horrible. They're terrible. And, you know, so I mean, what I have been seeing, and I've talked both to HR side as well as people who are more around your age, I've heard more people who go into an interview and they ask that question, how much do you crunch? And if they don't hear the answer they want, they walk. Even though it's a job they wanted at a company they wanted to work at, they basically say, you know what? I don't want to spend my life doing that. It's like, I want to work in the industry, I want to have a good job, but I don't want to work 14, 16-hour days for 3 months on end. That's ridiculous. And I think I've been encouraging more people to do that, because the more that hiring managers at companies hear that, the more they're going to get the message that maybe this doesn't work anymore. We can't get talent, if we're not going to be able to get talent if we just like tell them that we're crunching like that. And so I'm hoping we're going to see that change. But in terms of that stigma, it's like, I think that's a rarity. But I'm not doubting that it does happen still a little bit. Yes?
Kind of going off what you said about, you know, like if like you're crunching like these crazy hours, like is there any way that you can combat that? That's not just you like walking away from a company. Like, have you seen any way that said like, oh, we've like tried to talk to management, like, or like, you know, they've like done strikes or anything like that that have been effective in trying to convince a company that their crunch is not a good thing for people?
Yeah, we haven't, there's never been, to my knowledge, a strike, because there's no union, because that's usually a unionized action, collective action. But I've heard of developers like getting a couple of other people together, like a small group, and going to their direct manager and saying, look, this is ridiculous. You know, we have to message upwards that this is putting stress on us. We can't do our jobs. We're fatigued. We're missing things that we shouldn't be missing. And so I think there's some times where that works, and it just depends on the manager, you know, and it depends on the culture. I mean, the worst part is that there's still a few companies out there where there's a very fraternal feeling to the culture. It's like, well, this is how we do it. You know, it's like, if you can't take it, then you don't belong here, and you don't belong working in this industry if you can't take it. And that's just BS. I mean, but there's still some companies, and it's mainly, again, it's not a faceless industry. It's individuals. It's certain individuals who are stuck in an old way of thinking. If you happen to have one of those as a manager, it's going to be a little more challenging to deal with. But that's where you can run around them and just go talk to HR or talk to some other contact within the company and say, look, I want to voice my concern. Is that this is ridiculous. You know, and you can even say, I understand working small bursts of crunch to finish like a certain thing, but doing a death march for 6 months is just not going to work. And but I think it's important that people speak up and say something. And the nice thing that we have now today that didn't exist even 10 years ago is we've got social media. So we can always shame companies. Companies don't like being shamed. They do not like hearing that. So like, some people ask me, well, why don't we have a union? It's like, well, one of the things that unions do is the main reason you have a union is collective bargaining. But the other reason is unions, you do collective bargaining by what? By pressure, by group pressure. That's really the whole point, is you bring together people in the same kind of job and you apply pressure to the company from a certain direction. And so you can do that today on social media and get results. It may be kind of a crap storm for a while, but I mean, I did this on my trip to Sweden last week. British Airways screwed up my flight and I ended up having to get a room in Stockholm when I didn't intend to. So I had to pay for a room and I tweeted at them. You know, I'm like, hey, this sucks. You guys really blew it today. I'm really pissed off. I had to get a hotel room and spend $200 when I wasn't expecting to, blah, blah, blah. You know, and they were super responsive. And so they're like, oh, no, it's okay. You know, we'll fix this. We'll fix it. Now, maybe it's because I'm tweeting from my VGDA executive director account. That might have something to do with it. But no, I mean, they already fixed it. I mean, it's a week later and they already deposited the money to compensate. So I'm not saying that always works, but I mean, we have seen how social media can be leveraged in a way that can change behavior. We've seen it at all kinds of levels. We've seen it, I mean, even with something like the Arab Spring, you've seen governments overthrown because it started on social media. So I'm not saying you necessarily foment a revolt, you know, in that way, because ultimately I do believe very strongly that the constructive approach is better. That you go to the company with, you know, with talking points and with good arguments for why this is a problem and seek to listen. I would even bring them the Crunch Hurts white paper, say maybe you guys need to read this. It's a real short read, you can do it during your lunch hour. And, you know, give them resources to help them understand. And then if they just kind of blow it off and they keep persisting, then I think, you know, you might have to decide what else to do. So, yes?
All right, so like in other creative industries like movies,
Mhm.
stuff like that, I know crunch happens, but why is it so like prevalent in the game industry? I mean, not like we do the same kind of things, like movies are movies, games are games, they're
Yeah.
different. But like, why is it so accepted in the game industry? Is it just because like games just take a lot more time and we're using like an antiquated time frame of making a game should take like a year more?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's being shown with like DLC and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is that why? Like, or is it just a whole myriad of reasons
It's-
specific to games?
Well, the easy answer is there's a whole bunch of reasons, but in my perception, one of the main reasons is because games as an art form is a lot different from anything else. It's a lot different. I mean, look at film. Film has been around for over a century, and we know how to make a film. We have an idea. I mean, yeah, there's films that are bigger, more complicated. There's ones that are simple. But for the most part, we know how a film gets made. You write a script, there's a process, you have the script goes through the revisions, you get the talent, blah, 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 and you go out and you might do location, you might do green screen, whatever it might be. But, you know, we know how a film gets made. Whereas with games, the problem is that I think we as an industry, we are still not mature. This is an art form that's still very much still evolving. And so we're seeing that now with VR, which is really fascinating to me, is that people are like throwing game design documents out the window when it comes to VR. Because so much of game design as we know it is done through that peering through the 2D screen model. And what we're seeing now, for example, is, you know, in traditional AAA, you've got like an environmental artist, you've got a narrative designer. Very different functions, completely different functions. You know, they're obviously related to one another in terms of the game design, but, you know, but they're doing their jobs kind of separately. Whereas in VR, the narrative designer is often also the environmental designer because they're like this. I mean, they're so intertwined. How you experience that space is also very much a part of the narrative in a lot of VR experiences. So it's often somebody doing that work combined, or they're working extremely closely together. And so that's a situation we haven't had ever before. And now that VR is becoming more and more prevalent, we have to account for that. How do we deal with that? How the creative process has changed. So I think that's part of it. The other part that I see is that a lot of game projects, they never spend enough time in the early stage really figuring out exactly what they want to do. So they may have a script. So like, for example, I worked on Dead Rising 4, okay? They've already had 3 versions of this game. So how complicated is it? Now, of course, this version goes back, and the character of Frank from the first Dead Rising is back in the game, so it's different from Dead Rising 3. But it's the same kind of game, same kind of scenario, and where I've seen the problem in Dead Rising 4 was that they kept adding side quests. Because the main quest of the game was too simple and boring. Whose fault is that? Maybe you go back to the narrative designer and go back to the beginning where somebody should have asked during the script reading, this is too simple and boring. So I often see they don't do that because basically what happens is they'll say, okay, we need to make Dead Rising 4. Why? Because we need the money. We want to perpetuate the IP and perpetuate the franchise. Okay, great. When should we release Dead Rising 4? Well, let's go for holiday 2016. Okay, that sounds great. So what do we have to do? Well, basically, so what they automatically do, they set a release date, so it's got to be holiday 2016, then you back up the schedule all the way to where you are right now, which could be, let's say, mid-2014. So we've got 18 months to churn out this entire game, and so they just frantically, and that's not much time for a AAA game, 18 months, so that's a lot of pressure. So like, okay, you get a script done, you start doing artwork, you start figuring out this, you start doing this. So they are doing all these things concurrently in a very frantic mode, trying to stay coordinated as like someone's writing the script, someone's trying to figure out the game design, which you kind of already have the game design. You've already had 3 games that are very similar. So it's just sort of this frenetic pace where, oftentimes you'll hear of like in the movie industry, you'll hear about a script that's been around for 10 years and it's being rewritten 20 times. And that's not always a good sign. But the thing is that somebody's been kind of churning on the idea for a long time, kind of thinking about it, perfecting it, refining it. A lot of writers do this. They've got their book that they've actually had in their head for maybe 10 years, but they finally got it to a point where they're ready to write that particular book. And so that's the thing I'm not seeing in the game industry. And that, to me, is where the business side is overshadowing the creative side. Is where the business side is so dominant because we have to make money, we've got to get it out by a certain date, that it's not allowing time for the creative process that often happens in a lot of other projects. So that's kind of my perception of one of the main issues in the game industry. Now with indie projects, you don't see that as much because unless you're basically just sold your house and you're living in a friend's basement and you've only got like X months to make money, that's putting certain time pressure. But a lot of indie projects I see are something where they've already got a job or they're a student, so they're basically it's a kind of a work of love they're doing on the side that they hope to basically get to a point where they feel it's ready to release. And that's a completely different dynamic, obviously, because they've got the freedom to kind of think about it and ponder it and refine it and perfect it, at least to a certain point of creative perfection in their eyes, whereas in the AAA world, you don't. You have that constant time pressure, and that all they would have to do, like say on Dead Rising 4, is say, well, let's release holiday 2017. That'll give us enough time. But they're like, no, because in holiday 2017 we're going to be releasing this and this and this, and so we're not going to have time to fit it in there, because then it speaks to marketing schedules and shelf time and all that. It's crazy. It's a long answer.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, it's complicated. But to me, it's just, to summarize that long answer, basically, it's to me, it's the kind of the heavy hand of the business side overshadowing the creative side, and that's what creates that kind of crazy schedule.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick one. Yeah.
Yes.
You talked a bit earlier about some developers' conceptions about the industry. I was wondering if you met people who aren't developers, and what's like the biggest, what's the biggest misconception that you've heard from them looking at the industry, and that they think it is one way and really enjoy it?
They think that game development is just nothing but fun and smiles. It's like that would be the coolest job in the world, is to make a game. And because most people think that game development is gameplay. That's the biggest problem I hear. Even people I know, when I do my culturalization work, they're like, oh my God, you get to work on these games, that must be so much fun. It's like, okay, I'll talk about Rise of the Tomb Raider. I was excited to work on it. I loved the franchise, especially the way it's been reconfigured these days. And so it was fun to work on, but I've had to play through the game some levels like multiple times in my job. And I'm not playing the game. I'm intensely looking around to find things that could be potentially problematic. And if you played Rise of the Tomb Raider, there's tons of cultural artifacts in that game related to the Byzantine Empire. And so it's not fun, it's work, it's hard work. And so that's often the thing I hear from people who don't know anything about game development, is that they think it's nothing but easy and fun to do. You know, but then if you ask them, you kind of dig into their answer a little bit. So what do you think actually happens to do a game? They're like, I don't know. You know, it's like, well, somebody has to program, somebody has to do the art, someone has to do the writing. And so they don't really understand all the layers that go behind it. So, but that's usually the biggest thing. And the problem with that perception, though, is that that's often where I have found, and I purposely get into these conversations with people who feel that way, because I want to kind of dig deep and I want to kind of maybe needle them a little bit too. But I want to kind of see where their sensitivity lies, because when I start comparing them, like, well, how do you think a game developer compares to maybe like someone who writes books, an author? Well, they work really hard. That's like really hard stuff. They got to concentrate, and you know, they work for all this time. And I'm like, or you know, I'm like, and so game developers don't, just because it's a game that suddenly makes it easy and fun as a job. And so it's interesting. So. So the problem that I've often seen is that game development still has a huge misperception in the industry, or in the public's eye, in terms of what it is. I mean, even just gameplay does. Like when I tell people, like sitting on a plane, that which happens a lot, like, you know, did you know there's more 30 to 40 something women who play games than teen males? And some people are just like, that's not true. I'm like, it is true. I'm telling you, that's empirical fact. And they're like, well, no, that's not true. I don't believe that. Because that's not the media perception they keep getting reinforced. So they just like, no, that can't be. And so it's interesting.
That's the one that I've come across a lot, especially, I don't know if you've seen Owlboy. It was an indie game that was developed over 10 years, basically, released, gorgeous artwork, and gorgeous soundtrack, gorgeous everything. It's hard to find a review under a 9, but anyways, I go to the Steam reviews, and sometimes like one of the downers like, well, pixel art's really easy, you know. So
Yeah.
it's really?
Yeah.
That's your experience.
Yeah. No, there's one talk I give where I put up a picture of a Picasso and a Rembrandt, and I ask people to tell me which is better. You know, I put up a picture of like this incredibly well rendered artwork from Halo, and then I have like an 8-bit Mega Man, and I'm like, which one is better? You know, and you get people who are like pointing to either one, but like the point is that, you know, they're both art in their own way. They're both complicated in their own way. You know, you don't just write it off because it just happens to look simple or looks easy. So,
Cool. Thank you.
welcome.
Well, thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you.